So welcome back, everybody. In this session, we're going to be talking about the concept of alignment, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. So, when I was a very young teacher, I made it known to my class that I loved penguins. And as you might imagine, my students, over the course of the first several years of my career, made it their business to fill my entire desk and some of the shelves and eventually the back radiator with penguins, which they gifted me with in various forms and, you know, derivations over the course of much, time. And it was kind of a running joke in my classroom that we had all of these penguins. And so I remember that it was May inside of one of my first years of teaching, and I was teaching research writing for one of the very first times, which is incredibly complicated work. And I've since learned takes more than a couple of years to get good at as a teacher of writing. And I remember feeling really overwhelmed and frustrated by the quality of work that my students were doing, by the lack of effort that I perceived, and by their attitude and what I was dealing with inside of the classroom. They were in eighth grade. They were looking forward to moving up day and their eighth grade field trip, and I'm sure dealing with some stress over going to the high school as well. And so everyone's, energy was all over the place and nerves were frayed, and it was kind of an emotionally charged time. And I was taking no guff and thinking that I was doing the right thing, as so many new teachers do. We worry about classroom management, especially when we're young. And so I made my expectations for the project clear. I set very rigid deadlines, and I accepted no excuses and didn't want to hear it, necessarily when kids were not meeting my expectations very well. And one of my students, while I was out in the hall during our home base, communicated loud and very clearly the fact that he was or she was dissatisfied with how I was behaving, because when I came back into the classroom, some of my most prized penguins had been thrown out my classroom window. Oh, it's true. I deserved it. It took a couple of years for me to realize, that maybe I deserved that, and a whole lot of self-reflection. But, what was really interesting, and when I think back on that moment now, is funny as it is, there's some really important pieces of learning there that I kind of took away from it. It was very clear that someone's feelings were really hurt because they chose to hurt me in response, and they also kind of communicated that they didn't feel that they could solve the problem with me because they went behind my back and kind of, left their message through their penguin vandalism. Anyway, what I learned in that moment was that perhaps there was a bit of misalignment between my policies and my practices and the culture that I claimed constantly to want to be creating in my classroom. And I was one who was really good at always talking with my students about being human with one another and treating one another with respect and with kindness and practicing active listening. And yet I had this policy around this research paper that was inflexible and that was not open to conversation, quite honestly. And my attitude and demeanor toward the kids through this research project was one of, anywhere from mild frustration to disappointment. And they were really struggling with concepts that they had never, and skills that they had really never practiced before. And so I learned a lot. And that requires a lot of courage it was my experience, that there were some people inside of my system, people that I respected very much, teachers and even some administrators, although they were more distant from my work than my building leaders, but who really struggled very hard with the notion of me having a little bit more of a progressive attitude around the setting of practices and policies, and shifting them in some ways that made them a little more human-centered. And it was scary, and it was hard, and it was difficult to feel confident about what I was doing, but it was important work. And that's really what the work of this session is about. And it facilitates, I think, better relationships with parents as well.
Yeah. As parents, sometimes we get kind of confused or surprised about what the classroom practices and policies are and how they align with what we know to be the characteristics of a really compassionate teacher and someone who we know is genuinely concerned and motivated to help kids succeed and learn, and whose intention is good-hearted, and nature is good-hearted and compassionate. So sometimes we don't kind of know how to handle a situation where we know the teacher's well-intentioned and really cares about her students, and yet what she might be doing or saying in the classroom doesn't really align with that. For example, your story reminds me of a story that I'd like to share about my son, who was generally a really interested, motivated student, and when he felt uncomfortable with the material, generally for him it was math or science or something with regard to detail on maps, he maybe got a little bit more fidgety and asked more questions, and that was his way of trying to engage and keep himself interested when he got a little more anxious. And in 6th grade, he had a geography teacher where he was really struggling to figure out what she was talking about with maps and trying to put context, understand context when she was talking about world maps, and because he didn't really have that context. None of the kids have context, but some find it easier than others to visualize maps. So we talked with him a lot about how even though he didn't understand and he needed to ask more questions, sometimes he had to put his hand down and not be so quick to say, I need, and that we knew that she really was a good teacher, and maybe if he had a little bit more patience or listened a little harder, then he would eventually get it. But unfortunately for him at the time, and for us, because we were a little confused, she decided to dub him the most annoying student that she had ever had.
And she said that out loud.
She said that out loud, but I believe, still to this day, she was saying that good-heartedly.
Right, like to be funny.
Right, yeah. And in jest, and not to shame him. But he took it as, oh my God, I'm good. So he turned it around, because we talked about it a lot, and so one of the things he did to try to kind of crack her, as he moved closer and closer each day to the board, so he could be a little bit more annoying and ask more questions. At a holiday time, he decided, I'm going to get my teacher a frame picture of me so she doesn't forget me and she doesn't miss me over Christmas. And he did that, and he wrote her a little note, and I know that she appreciated that. Even though she was stone-faced, I just had a feeling that, because the rest of the year went a little bit better. And then he ended up taking that message and putting it on his resume. The most annoying student in geography class.
He listed that as an accomplishment on his resume.
Yes, he did. But the point of the story is that parents sometimes don't understand how a practice or a policy in a classroom or in a school could say one thing, and then an action of a teacher or administrator could say another thing and communicate a different message and not really be as compassionate as they might want to be and intend to be. So parents really don't know how to react to that or help. And what I love about this conversation and this work is that hopefully we'll have better conversations about that if we're talking about how to align visions and what is a parent's vision of a compassionate classroom and a compassionate teacher, what's your individual teacher or administrator's vision, and try to kind of work this out because we really all want the same thing. It doesn't always play out that way.
This is challenging work, and Ellen and I both recognize that. We do have some protocols that we're finding people appreciate in terms of revisiting policies and practices and making adjustments that don't just make things easier for kids, that definitely still hold a standard and allow them to be successful. But the reason why more and more kids are able to be successful is because the policy and the practice aligns with our values that we continue to communicate around compassion and around being empathetic human beings. And so much of what we've done in the past inside of schools, it's created some disconnection there, to the point where I think, I know for my own self, I wasn't really aware until I made an intentional effort to be reflective there. So as you're diving into the content for this particular session, know that the must-dos for this session are to take a peek at the tools that foster alignment and that will help you put a critical eye on policies and practices and start to refine them in a way that kind of meets everyone's needs. And that's the tricky part of the work. So as you're doing it, not only reach out to us if you have questions, but we really want to hear your success stories too. So if you're looking at a policy or a practice that you've had for a long time and you really know that you want to shift it in order to make it more compassionate and more empathy fueled, but you're saying to yourself, if I change it in this way, this other thing is going to fall apart. If I change it in that way, we're not going to be able to meet another standard. If that's what you're struggling with and you work through that struggle and find success, we really want to hear from you as well. Because those are the stories that we want to begin sharing and elevating so that other people can be inspired by them. So reach out to us on the Compassionate Classrooms Facebook page, through Twitter under our names, Angela Stockman and Ellen Vi Gray, or through our compassionateclassrooms.org website. We hope that you find the work of this particular section satisfying and rewarding, and we're really looking forward to your feedback too on how we can improve what we've put here and the tools that we've shared with you. And we'll see you in the next session, everybody. See you later.
So long.